Okay, in this video, we're covering the following learning objectives. So number one, we're going to describe the two parts of the pituitary gland. And yes, I know we've covered this already, but we want to add just a little bit more information. And as we add that information, that'll lead us naturally into discussing the anterior pituitary, which is where we're going to spend quite a bit of time. With respect to the anterior pituitary, we want to know these. How does the hypothalamus communicate with the anterior pituitary? What is synthesized and what is secreted from the anterior pituitary. And finally, we're going to talk a little bit more about the portal system. And again, I know you know some information about the portal system, but we'll give you a bit of a visual depiction as well. So as we get into it, so when you look at the the pituitary gland, remember what we've seen before. We saw that there's the hypothalamus and this is the pituitary gland. And there's a front part, an anterior pituitary, as well as a back part, which is the posterior pituitary. I also showed it to you this way before on previous slides, where the hypothalamus talks to the anterior pituitary versus the posterior pituitary. And so previously, although I don't think I really emphasized it very much, I do want to emphasize it now. The anterior pituitary goes by his own name. And again, you've seen this slide before, but the anterior pituitary goes by the name adenohypophysis. And the posterior pituitary goes by its own name called the neurohypophysis. And I have that on a separate slide here. The two parts to the pituitary gland, and the pituitary gland is also known as the hypophysis. The anterior pituitary is known as the adenohypophysis, and posterior pituitary is the neurohypophysis. Now, at this point, this idea of neurohypophysis should already be familiar, because you just say, okay, yeah, I remember that. We covered that because we consider that to be an extension of neural tissue. All these axons coming down from the nuclei within the hypothalamus down here, showing up in the posterior pituitary. So yeah, there's a bunch of neural tissue here in the posterior pituitary. Well, now then, what of the anterior pituitary? Well, the anterior pituitary, I've shown you here, and I've said, well, look, I've got a bunch of capillaries here and a bunch of capillaries here, and I have these little blood vessels connecting them, and these are the portal veins. So this system right over here is a portal system. This thing is called a portal system. If you look at some of the text on this slide, it says here, primary plexus of the hypophyseal portal system, secondary plexus of the hypophyseal portal system. So this thing is the portal system. Before we describe that a little bit more, let's just talk more about the anterior pituitary. So the questions that we want to know, how does the hypothalamus communicate with the adenohypophysis? Again, aka anterior pituitary gland. And the answer is through this thing called the hypothalamic-hypophyseal portal system, which is two capillary networks connected by a blood vessel. So now let's talk then about capillaries. And again, more on this in the vascular system, but here we've got these things called arteries, and here we've got these things called veins. And just as a general rule of thumb, it's not true 100% of the time, but it's true enough. I want you to think of arteries as containing good stuff. It's got all the good stuff. It's got the oxygen and the glucose and the amino acids and the lipids and whatever else you need to deliver to your tissues. So this down over here, off screen, would be your tissue. And whether you want to call that a muscle or a brain or whatever, it doesn't really matter. What ends up happening is that these arteries are big, thick roads, and you can see that the walls themselves are quite thick. What ends up happening is that eventually these start getting smaller and smaller, almost like the way, if you look at a tree, a big, large trunk separates into smaller branches, each of which then separates into smaller branches, so on and so forth. And finally, you get to these tiny little things, and that's where all the small little stems come out, which form the leaves, and things like that. So similarly, your vascular system has that kind of setup, where the big, giant, thick-walled blood vessels, arteries, will eventually branch off into smaller and smaller arteries, eventually which become tiny, thin little capillaries. So this right over here is an example of a capillary network. And these walls are actually super duper thin, and it's easily for stuff to diffuse out of the capillary walls and for stuff to diffuse in. So what that means then is you can visualize that as all the good stuff being the arteries, and then once that blood enters into the capillaries, I'm going to dump off all the good stuff. I'm going to deliver the oxygen to my muscle tissue. I'm going to deliver the glucose. I'm going to deliver the amino acids. I'm going to deliver the vitamins and minerals. I'm going to dump that off to the tissue itself. At the same time, I'm going to pick up the waste and things like whether it's lactic acid, whether it's carbon dioxide, whatever urea, whatever waste product there may be, I'm going to pick that up. So these walls need to be thin enough in order for me to dump out the good stuff and pick up the waste. And from there, these capillaries then converge to form bigger and bigger pipes again, which are the veins, which then have so-called like dirty blood, so to speak. And again, those are very loose descriptions, more detail in the vascular system. But what you want to appreciate then is the significance of a capillary. Now, here's what I want you to imagine. What I want you to imagine is that if we took, let me take a shape here like this. Let me take take that circle shape. And let's say we had, if you can imagine this thing being erased, imagine there's no vein here. Is there ever any need to have a capillary network like this, and then a blood vessel, and then here, let's put another capillary network right over here. So let's say these are also capillaries. Is there any need for that? And your answer should say, well, no, not really. I don't see a need for that. Why? Because, remember, I've dumped off the good stuff, picked up the waste, and now I've come back into some vein. And so now if I were to enter into another capillary bed, well, I don't have any more good stuff because I already dumped it off. I'm already chock full of waste, and so there's really no good reason to have another capillary system. In other words, you never see two capillary networks daisy-chained together by a vein or an artery. There's just no need for it. And so when you see these portal systems, which are where you see two capillary systems connected by blood vessels, keep in mind that they're very, very rare. We only have 3 examples of them in human physiology, and this is one of our examples. So then why do we have that example here? Here's why. Because here your capillary network serves a slightly different purpose. You know what? Let me go back to the slide that I used before so we don't confuse you. Let's use this slide. This is capillary network number 1. This is capillary network number 2. So let me just put these little circle things next to it again. I'll just annotate these and I'll call this capillary network, number 1. And then this one here is capillary network number 2. Okay, so if we clean that up a little bit, it'll look something like that. So there is capillary network number 1, and here is capillary network number 2. So where is capillary network number 1? It's in the hypothalamus. Where is capillary network number 2? It is in the anterior pituitary gland. And what are the blood vessels that connect them? They're called the hypophyseal portal veins. They're called the portal veins. So remember the definition again. The definition was a portal system is 2 capillary systems connected by a blood vessel. And I just showed that to you. These right here are 2 capillary systems, capillary network number 1, capillary network number 2, connected by a blood vessel or blood vessels. In this case, there's 2 of them, at least on this picture. So why do we have these 2 capillary networks? I just told you it would be functionally useless to daisy chain these 2 together, except for in these 3 situations. Here's why. What happens at capillary network number 1? The hypothalamus dumps hormones in. The hypothalamus dumps hormones in. And so that is the main function here at capillary network number 1. It's not so much this whole oxygen, glucose delivery, and all that kind of stuff. Well, what happens at capillary network number 2? So the anterior pituitary picks those hormones up, picks up those hormones that were just dumped into bed number 1, and it dumps its own hormones. I know you can't see that. Let me fix that here right now. So this is what happens in capillary network number 2. Anterior pituitary picks up those hormones that came from the hypothalamus, and in response, it'll make and manufacture its own hormones and dump that into the capillary network so that those hormones can travel somewhere else. So this is kind of the functional purpose behind these capillary networks, that you want to get something in over here and you want to deliver it in a relatively short distance away to another capillary system or to another tissue that is served by the second capillary system. So to answer the question again, how does the hypothalamus communicate with the anterior pituitary? It does it through the portal system. All right. So now the question then is, well, the anterior pituitary is derived from what? It's derived from epithelial tissue. Okay, there's your answer. It's derived from epithelial tissue. So I want you to be aware of that. We've spoken about that briefly before. And now we got to talk about, okay, well, what comes out through the anterior pituitary and such? And that I'm actually not going to answer. And so this section over here, what is synthesized from the anterior pituitary and what is secreted by the anterior pituitary, I'm actually not going to answer right now, because what that is, that's going to be an entirely different set of lectures, and that's going to be in the next PowerPoint that I'm going to post up for you guys. And that's going to include things like thyroid stimulating hormone, adrenocorticotropic hormone, growth hormone, all those types of things. So the next series of lectures, 3 or 4 lectures or so, are going to answer these 2 questions, B and C. So it's worth your while. I'm going to leave these learning objectives up. It's worth your while to know that these are the questions that you need to answer. But then, as long as you understand the answer to these 2 learning objectives comes through the next series of lectures. So to recap, here's where we are. We have now, let me get that recap one. We described the 2 parts of the pituitary gland, which is the adenohypophysis anteriorly and the neurohypophysis posteriorly. The anterior pituitary is derived from epithelial tissue, and we care about that because it is distinct from the posterior pituitary, which is derived from neural tissue. How does the hypothalamus communicate with the anterior pituitary? It does so through those portal systems, which by definition is a network where I have 2 capillary systems connected by a blood vessel. And we describe those as being capillary system number 1 is at the hypothalamus, and that's where the hypothalamus dumps hormones in. Where are those hormones going? It's going off to the anterior pituitary. And capillary network number 2 is where the anterior pituitary picks up those hormones, responds, makes something of its own, hormones, and then dumps those into those capillaries so then it can travel to the rest of the body. And what is synthesized from the anterior pituitary? A whole bunch of hormones, which we'll see in following lectures. And what is secreted? A whole bunch of hormones, which we'll see again, as I said, in following lectures. And portal system we've already defined. So that'll wrap it up for this video.